session, Leading with an Entrepreneur. Welcome everyone to our live session on Leading with an Entrepreneurial Mindset, an engaging webinar introducing key topics and faculty from Cornell's CXO Leadership Program. This next cohort, our 10th, begins May the 3rd, offering a 6-month executive education experience focused on developing a strategic mindset, cultivating resilience, and driving execution excellence. And it's delivered over 16 live interactive sessions. Participants also gain a full year access to Cornell's exclusive online library of learning materials. It's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed guest and also a professor in this program, Professor Neil Tarallo from Cornell University's S.C. Johnson College of Business. He's a senior lecturer specializing in entrepreneurship and innovation with a strong track record in both academia and industry. I personally found his book, Innovation and Corporate Renewal, especially insightful in positioning entrepreneurship as a driver of innovation, retention, and growth. Professor Tarallo previously served as academic director of the Pillsbury Institute for Hospitality Entrepreneurship, where he expanded its offerings from 2 courses into a full curriculum. He also works with global organizations to drive innovation and market development using a proprietary data-driven approach that engages all levels of the organization. His teaching experience mirrors his work with efforts across Africa, Europe, Asia, North and South America, and the Middle East, bringing a rich global perspective to discussions. We're lucky to have him with us today. Please feel free to raise questions in the Zoom interface. In today's workshop conversation, we're going to actually field mostly questions. We've had a lot of people wanting to ask questions. So we're going to make this really focused on answering the questions that you have. So in the bottom, you'll notice that there's a question and ask questions. Please make sure to use that. I'm going to take these questions and field them and introduce them to Professor Tarallo, and we're going to get started by getting started. Please join me in welcoming Professor Neil Tarallo. Neil?
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Mike. Pleasure to be here. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. And just to underscore something that Mike just said, please ask questions. Don't hesitate. I think part of what's going to make this interesting is your interaction. Mike and I can talk about this topic all day and all night, but your questions help us really drive value. And that's what innovation is all about. That's kind of the foundational element of what I teach. How do we drive value? How do we create a competitive advantage? And what's missing in our leadership style or what's missing within our organization that allows us to do that? Thanks, Mike.
All right, well, so the first questions actually come in our daily work, we often encounter roadblocks. How can we apply an entrepreneurial mindset to identify creative solutions that are not obvious? And this is from Fahad.
So I think, here's where it gets interesting for me. And Fahad, thank you very much for that question. People mistake entrepreneurial thinking and behavior. And by the way, we have a nice body of research that really supports the fact scientifically that entrepreneurs think differently than the rest of the world. They think, they behave, they reason differently than the rest of the world does. And where I have focused my attention is how do we take that behavior and apply it within the context of an organization in an entrepreneurial, if you're familiar with that word, or corporate entrepreneurship fashion. And when I look at innovation, and over the last 24 years of teaching, I've developed kind of a proprietary process for innovation. The missing link, as I call it, for most organizations is an opportunity to think and behave entrepreneurially. So to get to Fahad's question, if we take the constructs that we've learned from entrepreneurs and how they behave and how they reason, and apply them within the organization, we can really create these novel creative solutions. And we do that simply by testing and experimenting. We just give it a little different context. And the way I think about it is I break my company up, if you will, into 2 components. The exploitive part of what we do, which is our existing business model. That's what drives our current revenues and profits. And the part that most companies miss is the explorative part. Within each of these elements of a company, the leadership behaviors are 180 degrees opposite of each other. So what we're taught and what we're rewarded for is what we call causal reasoning or causal thinking. And it's very appropriate when we're leading and managing companies. But we want to explore when we want to find solutions to problems for real people and real organizations, we need to have a different mindset and a different approach to things. And these two things are opposed. If we try to do them just kind of as a matter of fact or within our course of doing our business every day, they tend to create a lot of friction. So by separating those and thinking about those, I think that helps me along those lines. And then by applying some of the constructs of entrepreneurs within the context of an organization, I can test, I can experiment. If I'm really doing this well, I clearly understand what constraints exist in reality and which ones are kind of built in based on my biases, what I've learned or seen happening all the time. And when I can break through those constraints, imagined constraints, that's when I really start to create novel, creative solutions to problems. That's a great question. Thank you.
And I really love how you actually help separate the exploratory from the exploitative, and that's really the two functions of a business, and making sure that you actually lead differently in both situations. The next
Yeah, and
question
I
that came
think
in. Oh, yep. Go ahead. Sorry.
just a little bit more on that, if you don't mind, Mike. I call this multi-dimensional leadership because it's really two tools. It's not that one, and I think I should emphasize that it's not that one is better than another. But in today's world, we're moving so fast and things are changing at the speed of light. Understanding when and how to use these two tools is really, really what's impactful for us. And that's why we want to be thinking about it that way. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead. We have another
No,
question.
no, no. I was just going to tee up the next question, which came from Monica. And she asked, how can we foster a culture of experimentation and small bets within our teams to test new ideas without significant risk?
That's a great question, and risk is something
Mhm.
that many companies are very concerned about, and I think rightly so. If you think about my response to Fahad's question in breaking up our company, and this is not breaking it up physically, this is kind of breaking it up conceptually into exploitive and explorative. We can protect the brand, we can protect our existing business model when we think about that exploitive part. And again, the framework that entrepreneurs use really help us here. And it's part of what I teach when I talk about multidimensional leadership. I'll give you an example. One way that entrepreneurs approach risk is rather than viewing what they're about to undertake in terms of what's my return on investment, what are the financial KPIs that might be impacted here, and then make an evaluation of what we potentially could lose or gain. What entrepreneurs say is this: look, we're entering an environment where prediction is not possible. If we try to predict, we're likely going to be wrong, or it's likely going to take us in the wrong direction. So here I go into my explorative mode and I say, let me test an experiment. And rather than say, what's the return on investment versus what we could potentially lose, entrepreneurs say, what can I lose? What can I afford to lose today? And that could be dollars and cents in U.S. currency, or it could be time. And typically, those are the two variables that we think about. For instance, in businesses that I still run, we think about, look, we're going to make this investment. We think it could pan out in the future. This is an explorative part. We can afford to spend, I'm just going to pick a number here, $100,000 to test this and experiment and try some things. And we'll spend a year to do that. And after a year, if we don't have some real hard data that shows us whether or not we have a path forward, we just quit. We just stop. And so adopting this constraint that entrepreneurs do really manages risk. And notice I use that word manage, not mitigate. I never try to reduce risk to zero. I'm always managing risk to a level that I'm comfortable with. This tends to do that in a really powerful way.
I really appreciate that. The next question came in, although the name is a little curious as well, I guess. Curious Campus asked the question, How do you balance the entrepreneurial spirit of an individual employee with the processes of an organization? I think that that kind of builds on this concept that you were just sharing before.
Yeah, and it's really a great question, and it's the challenge of being a multidimensional leader, and how we approach that and how we recognize that. Look, if you think about this, um, the causal reasoning or causal thinking or behavior, which is what most of the world applies, is appropriate for running a business. As I said, we reward people for prediction, we reward people for strategy and how we break that out. But the reverse is, if people are behaving like entrepreneurs within an organization, they tend to get disciplined, right? You're stepping over the line. That's not the way we do things here. That's we're not all about that kind of behavior. So how do you align those things? And I think having an understanding of these two approaches to problem solving, to thinking about what the future look like, is the first part. The second part is creating a culture around innovative behavior, innovation mindset, or entrepreneurial mindset. And that can be challenging. I am not a person that supports the notion that you need to replace the existing culture in an organization with an innovation focused culture. I think we can augment the existing cultures that have served us well over the years. And then it's just about really how we approach failure, how we look at failure as opportunity rather than as a negative outcome. And for me, the biggest impact in how we give folks that opportunity is, as a leader, how do we behave? How do people see us? It's easy to write a mission statement or a value or vision statement, post it on a website. It's easy for a leader to speak about, hey, everybody should feel comfortable trying new things. You don't need approval from managers to go do that. It's a whole nother story when you behave that way. I once had a manager, Mike, who said to his staff, um, "Don't do what I do, do what I say." And I remember this, and this was a long, long time ago. And I remember this like it was yesterday, and his name was George. And I said, "George, how can you possibly expect people to do what you say if you are not behaving the way that you want them to behave? People will emulate a leader's behavior." And that's
Right.
why we have to know that the microscope is always on us. People are always looking at not just what we are, or not just listening to what we say, but looking at what our actions are, what our behaviors are to support that context that we're trying to provide. That's the challenge, and I think it really comes through that. The second challenge is, how do I move that through the whole organization? And that's something I work with organizations on in a pretty big way. It's a shift, and it's about change management and how we really think about building into that new culture, or building into the existing culture a new dimension, a new way of thinking and behaving. Great question. What a great question that was.
Yeah. So, building on, I guess, Curious Campus's point, Rinaldi asked the question, how can an entrepreneurial mindset help early stage SaaS founders build credibility and traction in highly regulated industries like financial services?
So here's something that's really interesting for me. I talked about constraints a little bit, and um, one of the things I do a lot of work in the financial space. I do a lot of work in healthcare these days as well. And one of the things that regularly appears is this notion that we can't do this because there's a regulation that prevents us from doing this. And what I've started to do is say, let's get that regulation. So that's the first thing for me. One of the things that we're finding, particular in these two industries, is that how the regulation has been interpreted, sometimes over decades, is no longer accurate. The interpretation has kind of drifted. And if you really look at the regulation, it doesn't say what we think it says today. So that's the first step for me. How do we do that? The second thing is, look, it's about creating these novel creative solutions. And the way we approach that is by interacting with the market, interacting with people, understanding what constraints are there. So first we make this decision or this determination of what constraints are real and what constraints are imagined. That's the first thing. Set aside those imagined constraints. So often the constraints that we think are there are put there in our minds. So now the real constraints act as catalysts for creativity if we approach them with the right frame of mind, not inhibitors of delivering value. And that's kind of a shift in mindset that we get when we think about multidimensional leadership and how we can use that. So for me, it's what constraints are real, what are imagined, change the way we think about these constraints once we understand what they are and whether they're real or not, and use them as an opportunity. Remember, it's a competitive advantage when we have this mindset because the rest of the industry is still going on first the assumption that that constraint is indeed a real constraint, right? So if we can move that away. The second is they move away from those constraints. But if we embrace them, find ways to test and to try and experiment and to create great solutions to problems or pain points or gaps in the market that the market is experiencing, we can do so within the guardrails, if you will, that those constraints provide. So embracing those things rather than moving away from them. For me, and I think this really comes from entrepreneurial mindset and becoming a multidimensional leader, great innovators, great entrepreneurs understand that where there's chaos, where there's change, where there's restrictions, there is the opportunity, there's the ability for us to create opportunity at the highest level. The rest of the world is running away from these things. So this is part of the culture shift that we talked about with the last question or last two questions and how we can move towards them instead of away from them. And I think that's a key component to this as well.
I'm going to take Hemal's question really to build on this concept of mindset, and you've shared that entrepreneurialism is a mindset shift that you sort of have to have available to you, and it's almost like another gear when you recognize that the situation requires a different approach that you actually have to slip into this mindset. Hemal's question is, how can someone cultivate a growth mindset during constant uncertainty and failure?
I think that that's what it's all about. If I were to sum everything we're talking about today, it's in this question right here. And I think Himal was the person who posed it. So great question. Look, these two methods of thinking and behaving and reasoning, causal and effectual, right? Effectual being the way entrepreneurs think and behave and reason. They're really about prediction and control, if you think about it. The causal way, which is what we're taught in just about every business school I've ever encountered, graduate business program I've ever encountered anywhere in the world, is absolutely appropriate. When we have data, we want to use that data to predict, right? That's a good place to be. But what do you do when you don't have that data? And that gets to the heart of this question. It's about control then. And one of the interesting things we find in the research is that entrepreneurs believe they can control their future. Honestly, I believe I control my future based on the decisions that I make. And I think understanding that uncertainty means data is not available, and we should not try to use data in order to predict when we are not in that situation. And here's what I mean. If you think about the pandemic globally, right? COVID, to me, this is the most telling example. The United States and many countries, matter of fact, I'd say most countries follow the United States down this path because we're so conditioned to predict. We want to know what tomorrow is going to look like. We reach for data, and that data could be inappropriate, it could be incomplete. And when we use that data to make a prediction, we're wrong. That is what happened during the pandemic. We were experiencing something that we've never experienced before. Uncertainty was high. When uncertainty gets high, anxiety gets high with it. That anxiety drove politicians globally to say, we have to tell people how this is going to end. And so they made predictions. A small number of countries, and in the United States, a small number of states, said, wait a minute, we can't predict this. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to try things. We're going to create a safe environment right now, and we're going to try things. What works, we're going to push forward with. What doesn't work, we're going to toss away. And that's what happened. And if you really look at it that way, it's the way we can approach these things and how we can think about it. Again, competitive advantage here, because organizations who don't have these two tools, that do not have this multidimensional leadership approach, are making decisions based on incomplete or non-existent data. And because of that, they're moving in the wrong direction. We create our future. This is what the belief of entrepreneurs based on the research by the decisions we make as we test and experiment. So I think that's really the way I think about it. We're experiencing that in the United States and globally right now. The same thing is happening with the new administration in the United States and all the stuff with the tariffs. People are pushing for certainty. And we can't provide that certainty. And because of that, we see how people view our government right now as kind of sliding down. Once we get into a more certain situation, we're going to see the stock market move forward again. We're going to see people's opinions of the administration rise again. And it's an interesting play on certainty and uncertainty and how we are conditioned from the time we enter school as children, how we are conditioned to rely on prediction as paths for our life. We're actually born to be entrepreneurial thinkers, and we change into more causal thinking the more and the longer we are in education.
You know, you just made me think of Professor Howard Stevenson, the famous
Mm.
professor of entrepreneurship from Harvard, who said that predictability is really part of the key of the trick here. But the trick is not to actually fall into the trap of wanting to be predictable. It's to actually strive toward predictability. And it's that tension and managing that tension that you're sharing here. The next question came from Rinaldi, and that builds on this. And it's sort of like, how do you stay resilient within this entrepreneurial path when everything feels uncertain?
So, two things I'd like just a quick kind of subtext on our last question and something you said, Mike. I have a tool that I deliver in this program in the multidimensional leadership session that I do called the Nova U, and it's actually a framework for how to decide when you should be taking a causal approach or when you should be taking an effectual approach, and how to execute both of those as part of the process. And it includes kind of a quick evaluation of the current situation, where you are as an organization, and then how you push that through the company. So we do have tools, and I'm not the only one. There are other people developing tools like that that kind of come along behind it, I think. And so how do you stay resilient with that? This is I think something that comes up often for me, but it's really a simple answer. The science tells us clearly that when we give people the opportunity to behave entrepreneurial, to use this multidimensional concept, the intrinsic value they get from their job increases. When we as leaders start to apply the principles of multidimensional leadership to our leadership style, fear is reduced and sometimes even eliminated. And it's in those two components that people experience the the exhaustion, if you will, that leads us to struggle with resiliency and why we need to be thinking about that. There's a lot of science around resiliency, and I believe we do talk about it. Some of the Cornell faculty do deliver content on it in this program. But the element of entrepreneurial thinking and behavior and how we apply it in the multidimensional leadership context really gives us the foundation and the platform for that. If you think about the things that um, create this level of exhaustion within people that leads us down this path of not being productive as employees, multidimensional leadership helps us with that. It helps us understand that wherever anxiety exists on my team, which is a builder, right, of this kind of apathy and exhaustion, uncertainty has to be present. That is something right out of the world of psychology. It's very clear research. So if I understand that as a leader, if I see my people feeling stressed out or anxiety being an issue for them, I know that they're not being as productive as they could be. They're not getting the work done. If they're doing it, they're not doing it as well as they possibly could. And for me, as somebody who's owned businesses and managed teams, I know that people inherently want to be the best they can be within their jobs. And yes, there are a few exceptions to that, but part of my job is, hey, if you're not able to be the best that you can be, what are the things that are getting in the way of you doing that, and how can I remove those things? And one of the tools that multidimensional leadership gives us is this understanding that where anxiety and stress exist, uncertainty is almost always the creator of that stress and anxiety. So simple conversations can help us with this. If we just sit down and say, where's this uncertainty? How does this, what's happening here, and kind of work through that with our team, that really helps them move forward and move through that. That was a long answer to that question. I hope I got to the core of it.
You certainly did. And in fact, you actually, you raised a couple of really key points that answer a few other questions. I mean, that came in. We had about 15 questions come in while you were asking that question. But the point that you're sharing on that is actually by shedding a light, by turning the uncertain and the unknown often is actually something that's also unspoken. And by actually shining a light on the unspoken, you change the focus or the attention. One of the questions that came in on this concept um, is really what's that, I guess it's a little bit of a spin, but Sarmad Qureshi said, what's the difference of a mindset of a brilliant employee and a creative entrepreneur? And I think that this is actually going to get to a nice little place for you to go a little bit deeper into this multidimensional minds, multidimensional leadership model.
Yeah, I mean, it depends, I guess, a little bit on how we define brilliant. Because often brilliant and creative kind of move together. But let's keep it in the context that we've been talking about, right? If we say brilliant is on the causal side and creative is on the effectual side, give me that question again. What was the particulars on the distinction between the two,
What
Mike, please?
Yeah, what's the difference between, how would you distinguish between a brilliant employee and a creative entrepreneur?
So if I keep it in that context, right, causal and effectual, um, and the brilliant being on the causal side, effectual being creative being on the effectual side, brilliance to me there is really an ability to understand and determine what the data is telling us, by which we can make a prediction. And I'll take it even farther. This is a great question. I've never even thought about this before. And I'll take it a little bit farther. When I'm thinking off the top of my head and speaking, it's always a dangerous thing. But I'll take it a little bit further. I think that understanding as a leader that causal is probably the tool we're going to be executing more frequently, right? Ourselves. And an understanding of effectual reasoning is what we're going to be supporting more, right? And thinking about it that way. To me, brilliance on the causal side means first step, I understand when I need to be effectual, when my teams need to be effectual, when my company needs to be effectual, and when we need to be causal, right? To me, that's brilliance. That's really how we drill down onto this. And in that brilliance is when I make that determination, being courageous enough to take the path, right? And the courage is most often going to come on the effectual side. So to me, these aren't necessarily separate, brilliant and creative. To me, they're just different, right? And so for me, the courage is, and you think about CEOs and companies historically who have had this courage and who have not had this courage. In my world, I was in the photographic industry for many, many years, taking my companies through the transition from film to digital imaging. And in my world, Eastman Kodak didn't have the courage to do what they needed to do. They chose to stay with film because it was the safe bet. It was less risky. And at that time in the world, Eastman Kodak had more intellectual property in digital imaging than the rest of the companies in the world combined. And that's not an exaggeration. Eastman Kodak had been working with the US military for decades on digital imaging. What they said is, we don't want to make that transition. We like where we are. We're the leader here. We're going to keep pushing this forward as long as we can. That CEO lacked courage. I'm sorry to say that, but that's the absolute truth. You have to be courageous in this place. And so to me, that's part of brilliance. The creativity part is just our willing to think differently, our willingness to and our ability to be objective and recognize biases that come into play, how we've thought about things always, the way we've always done them. Creativity for me is creating ad hoc innovation teams where we bring people into our team from outside the organization, or people who have no knowledge whatsoever of the technology that we're talking about or applying, because they can give us a diversity of thought that we will not get within our own organization. So I think those are the two elements in the way I think about brilliance and creativity. And I'm just tossing courage in there too, because I think you do need to be courageous to be a CEO, and also a board of directors fill this role as well, and move into a space where there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of unknown, and how we do that. And we talked about this earlier, and manage our risk to an acceptable level.
Well, I'm really sorry that we actually won't be able to get to some of these awesome questions that are in queue, but we're at the end of the time here. I want to take a moment here to thank you very much, Professor Neal. This has been a very lively and fun conversation. Just before we leave, I'd love to have you have your final parting thought to leave folks with their minds as they're thinking about either the CXO program, or really just even thinking about the multidimensional model, the multidimensional leadership model, and how they could apply it in their lives right now. As a closing thought for today.
Sure, I appreciate the opportunity. I guess for me, it's not just a model, right? It's a way of being. It's a presence. It's how you approach work and life. And when I talk about this, and when I write about this, I write about it in three specific contexts. One is how does it apply for my company? How does it apply for me in a professional sense in terms of my job and my career? And then also, how does it apply, excuse me, personally? Because I think there are great applications in all three. I think multidimensional leaders move forward when others hesitate. They create from these constraints that we talked about, and they lead without a script. We're not predicting. We're moving through this. So for me, it's not just about leading for clarity. It's becoming the clarity as we lead, and that's the play on words that I use for that.
I absolutely love become the clarity as we lead. That's such a great way to end today's session. Thank you so much, Professor Tarallo, and thank you everyone for the great questions, the great conversation we've had today. I hope you guys actually take a look at the CXO program. Again, it starts in May. The 10th cohort is actually launching in May, and we'd love to have you join us and join Professor Neal as one of the faculty in this program. Thanks, everyone, and have a lovely day.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.